one of the larger concepts of macroeconomics is understanding how is our nation as a whole doing? How do we measure our nation's output? So that's what we're going to be looking at inside of this lesson. And central to the idea of understanding a nation's output is to look at the gross domestic product. This is abbreviated as the GDP. This is the dollar amount of all final goods and services produced within a country's national borders in a year. So they do this every year. They determine the GDP on an annual basis. Now, here's the interesting thing. Some people would look at foreign-owned companies inside of the United States and say that's actually taken away from the wealth of the country. But foreign-owned companies within the borders of the United States actually contribute to our GDP. Do you know what doesn't contribute to our GDP? When American companies send jobs overseas and have factories in other countries. That doesn't contribute to our GDP. That doesn't help our nation's output because it's actually putting the productivity in another nation's borders. Now, the way that we gather this information of gross domestic product is by multiplying all of the final goods and services that are produced in a one-year period by their price, and then you add them all up to get the total dollar value of production. So we're looking at goods and services over the course of an entire year, and we're multiplying them by the price that is presented for them. Now, there are some things that aren't going to be included in the gross domestic product. For instance, intermediate products. These are products that are used to make other products already counted in gross domestic products. So let's think about this. For instance, let me give you an example. Let's say that you're a car company and you sell a car. What goes along with that car? Many things, right? There are many different products that are included within the vehicle. But let's take, for instance, tires. Do we need to include the price of the tires in the GDP? Do we need to include the price of production for those tires, or does that get wrapped into the production of the vehicle? Because sometimes tires can be used for the production of a new car, but then sometimes people buy new tires just on their own. So tires are actually an example of something that could fall into an intermediate product like it would with a new car. You wouldn't count the tires at that point in the GDP, but you would for companies that are just selling tires to people to replace the tires that are on their cars. So in the first instance, where the tires are actually included with the vehicle, that's just a total product. But in the second instance, where there's a tire company that's selling tires, that's a new product that's being sold. They're not an intermediate product at that point. Another exclusion from the GDP would be secondhand sales, because there's nothing new being produced in this way. And lastly is non-market transactions. And non-market transactions would be things that don't take place within the market. There may be production, there may be value that's associated with them, but they don't get measured on the market in the same way. And it's too hard to track them. Like, for instance, stay-at-home parents. If there's a mom or dad who stays at home and takes care of children and takes care of the home and prepares meals and does all of the services that are necessary to keep up the home, we don't necessarily think of that inside of a market transaction. But if that did have value, if that did get dollars attached to it, think of the billions of dollars that would be attached to that industry, right? Like, there's hours and hours of labor that go into that particular service. But because it doesn't get measured in a market transaction, it's not going to be included in the gross domestic product. Now, typically, if you see the gross domestic product rising, things are going well. That usually means things are going well. But it doesn't tell the whole story. We need to be careful about this, because there are two things, actually, we would need to consider. How are we getting a higher GDP? And what is that higher GDP doing to our quality of life? So, for instance, let's say that the United States enjoys a huge growth in the expansion of our GDP. Is that good news? Well, if as we look at it, we realize that the reason why we have a huge expansion in the gross domestic product is because the United States is getting involved in illegal activity or dangerous activity or activities that Americans would generally not want to be involved in. Then we might look at that and go, you know what? No, that's a negative means by which the GDP is growing. That's not a good thing. Or what if, with the growth of the gross domestic product, our quality of life is actually declining? What if there are huge consequences that come about because of the growth of gross domestic product? When you have a growth of gross domestic product, there will be consequences that come along with that. And that has to be factored in. Is this always good news? Typically, yes. Typically, it means that there are more people that are doing better. But it doesn't always mean that, and we do need to factor in many different factors when we're considering whether or not the growth of GDP is a valuable thing. Now, the way that we measure national income inside of the United States actually comes down to 5 factors. So that's what I want to break down here at the end of this lesson. The first of these factors is the gross national product. The gross national product is the dollar value of all final goods and services and structures produced in 1 year with the labor and property supplied by a country's residents. So what are the goods, what are the services, what are the structures that we have put together because of the people that are present inside of this country? The second factor in the national income is the net national product. So you take the first factor, the gross national product, and you subtract depreciation from it. Depreciation would represent the capital equipment that is worn out or become obsolete over the year. So to produce all those goods, services, and structures, you're going to use capital equipment. And in using that capital equipment, you're going to use it up. So we take away the depreciation from that. That's your net national product. The next thing we would look at is national income. This would be the income that is left after all taxes, except for those connected with corporations. And then that is subtracted from the net national product. So that's the third. The fourth is personal income. Personal income would be the income going to consumers before the income taxes are subtracted. And the last factor in measuring national income is disposable personal income. This is the income that the consumer sector has at its disposal after personal income taxes are taken out. So there are many factors that go into measuring national income, and there are many factors that go into developing the gross domestic product. Measuring a country's wealth, measuring a country's success economically is a complicated task. It isn't as simple as just saying, how much money did we make? It's going to be taking in many different factors, including how are companies doing, how are individuals doing, what resources were used, what resources were used up, and what resources were actually able to be produced and sold inside of this nation.